everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel. And today I have another video for you all today. Before we get into things, I just have to mention that right before I started filming, an entire pack of motorcycles went by. And I don't know if that means anything, but it is very on theme. I did also try to do my makeup and hair in the spirit of things, but listen, I have pretty long hair at this point. It is very fine. I cannot hold a curl in it to save my life. I have literally been to multiple professional hair people to try and see how to curl it, and it just doesn't work for more than an hour. So, this is what we're working with. And I hope the attempt is like 15% Rita Hayworth, and even if I don't get that close, I made an attempt, and I hope that you all appreciate it. So, as you can likely tell from the aesthetic as well as the title, today we are going to be talking about 1950s household dynamics. And I know that many of you have been waiting for this one for a very long time, and I am excited to talk about it. And I just thought now was the perfect time since I did just mention it in a recent video. So let's go ahead and get into it. I do need to first mention that when I was researching this, I did discover that compared to a lot of the other more recent 101 topics that I've done, there are actually many places for information about what this is, and not all of them agree with each other. So, with that in mind, I am going to do my best to synthesize this and summarize what those viewpoints are, but just know I do always encourage you to research for yourself. My word is not the be-all end-all. If for some reason when I am explaining this it doesn't fully resonate with you, that is totally okay. Go ahead and look at some of those additional resources. Now, just because this is like fairly obvious from the title maybe, you might think, okay, well, you don't need to explain what it is. It's like 1950s, right? What can that mean? I do think it is worth defining what I am referring to, though, just to make sure we are all on the same page. So when I say something is a 1950s dynamic, I am referring to, typically, a BDSM power exchange relationship that takes on the roleplay flavor of the 1950s. Having said that, though, I do think there are ways to engage in this just in a scene space if that's what you want, or maybe you aren't ready for a full-on DS dynamic involving this type of roleplay. So don't worry, we will talk about that as well towards the end of the video. But as always, one of the first questions that we need to ask ourselves as we go into topics like this is, why would someone find this appealing? Why would someone want to recreate Leave It to Beaver in their everyday life? And there are many answers to that. So first of all, we do have to recognize that many people have fetishes for the clothing or behavior that was more common in that era. Maybe it's for seamed stockings or flat-soled high heels, or the outline of a nipped waist that is created by a corset or certain cuts of clothing. Some people may really be into the image of a man smoking pipe tobacco and having his feet up while reading a newspaper. Of course, during this era as well, we do start to see some of the first very classic enduring fetish imagery start to pop up. There is, of course, the infamous Tom of Finland, but on something that's a little bit closer to what we're looking at, we would see maybe the works of Bazaar Magazine and John Willie, or perhaps the more fetishistic side of pinup models like Betty Page. If you found things like that appealing, wouldn't you want to recreate them in your everyday life if you could? I can certainly see the appeal. On the more mental, emotional side of things, I think especially if you are American, the 1950s has this sort of air of being a really idyllic, calming, very just soothing time period to be in. It was like when life was simpler, right? And of course, we've even seen this on some more recent TV shows like WandaVision, and without getting into spoilers, it certainly seems that the show, because it starts in the 1950s, or at least the TV from that time period, there is that sense that this is a simpler time that is calmer and easier to be in than the decade we live in now. And so there is that escapism behind it, that idea that, going to this place, going and recreating this era is comforting in some fashion. Now, of course, the actual history of that time period is much more complicated than what you would typically get from having watched the TV shows from that era, but it's not really about necessarily literally recreating the social expectations or the real history of what happened in that decade. It's about the mood, it's about the feeling of being in the 50s, the sort of impression that was left behind from the media of that era. And both in the media of that era as well as in the reality, it was a time that was much more socially structured. There was a lot more of a rigid hierarchy and a social order. And if there is one thing that maybe you have picked up on from my many 101 videos, it is the fact that kinky people love picking up on natural examples of existing hierarchy and then contorting them for our own purposes. Whether that be the natural imbalance of power that happens between a boss and a secretary, or between a student and a teacher, or in this case, between a typical 1950s husband and wife. And that is really the basis for a lot of this kink, and I will get into alternatives and different styles later on, but it does often revolve around the nuclear household of the 1950s family, of that husband and wife, and the husband being the head of the house and the wife being the submissive follower of the husband. And also, just to quickly mention, there were a lot of TV shows from that era that people might want to use as examples for their dynamics that maybe they sort of glommed onto earlier on, or they just like the name of it. Like literally, there were shows called Father Knows Best and Make Room for Daddy. So did you expect that people were just gonna hear that and not try to make it kinky? Because people have definitely decided to go ahead and make those things kinky. But moving on, I next want to talk about some of the relationship structures that people try to create with their 50s dynamics. As I mentioned, this is something that is typically the husband and wife household of that era, and that can mean that people assume this is for the heterosexual and the monogamous, and that doesn't have to be the case. You don't always have to play things straight, I guess literally in this case, and again, we will get to that a little bit later on. But on the most kind of common level, what this means is you will have typically the dominant be the husband character, and he is the one that is the head of the household, or the HOH. He is the one that is in charge and making decisions, whereas the wife is the submissive, and they are the one that is following and is subservient to the husband. Now, keep in mind, you don't have to be married for this, but a lot of people that do this are. And I am using the terms husband and wife here as a starting point because that is typically the base roles that this kink is trying to play around with, but you don't have to use that if it doesn't make sense for you or if you don't like it. So for example, for the dominant male head of household, you might say dearest husband, or DH, or dear, or sir, or daddy, and that last one is actually somewhat historically accurate, at least if Masters of Sex is anything to go by. For the submissive wife, that can basically be anything you want it to be. Any sort of pet name, sweetie, dearest, honey, honey pie. You can get as cloying as you want to, and the fun thing about this is most of these are names that you can totally say in public and not ever raise an eyebrow. Again, the typical basis for these relationships would be power exchange alongside the role play. For some people, that means like fully getting into a 1950s lifestyle with retro furniture and retro clothing, or at least retro reproduction clothing, and sort of living it as a full-on lifestyle 24/7, including the whole visual aesthetic. For other people, it is less about accurately replicating the aesthetic and more about going from that structure and mood. And of course, you can be at some point between either one of these two spots, or do one as kind of the default and do the other for more special occasions or for individual scenes. But let's look at some examples for how this structure might look. One being the dominant is the one that works outside the home and is in fact the one that is allowed to work outside the home. And the submissive is the one that stays at home and is a homemaker. If they do earn their own money, it is inside the home, maybe doing traditional activities like making jams or pickles, or maybe being a seamstress. Two, being that the dominant is the one that makes the money in this arrangement, the dominant may set an allowance for the submissive, with the submissive having to ask for permission before spending any money on non-household related frivolous expenses. 3. The divisions of labor in the home run along pretty traditional lines. Because the submissive is the one staying at home, they are the ones that are expected to do the cooking, cleaning, laundry, errand running, picking up around the house, all of that sort of a thing. If the dominant does help out, it is seen as like a very special treat that, ooh, he helped with the dishes one night. Or perhaps he only does sort of approved things like taking out the garbage or mowing the lawn. If you want to really get into the chore aspect of this, if you are on the service end, there are some great 1950s chore charts that will literally fill an entire day and keep any service sub busy. So I will put information on how to find those chore charts down below if you maybe want some additional ideas or a really clear structure to start with, or maybe you just want to have a really brutal punishment for a brat that hates cleaning. 4. Although this is common with most power exchange relationships, it is sort of taken that the dominant is the one that is making decisions, and it's their perspective and desires that get defaulted to. However, unlike in other relationships, this has the specific flavor of being because the dominant is the head of the household and going back to more of those traditional expectations. 5. Manners may be an important part of this dynamic, not forgetting to say your pleases and thank yous and remembering your yes sirs and yes ma'ams. And this gets to an interesting point of intention, because also there are expectations on the dominant side here as well, potentially for gentlemanly behavior, remembering to get a woman's coat or pull out a chair for her or open a door or hold an umbrella. Depending on how you want to play with this, that could either be a dominant authoritative sort of paternal caretaking role, or it could be something that is submissive. So it does depend, and this actually offers some pretty neat ways of playing around with those traditional values. And 6. Finally, of course, not everyone has sex that goes with their kink, but for some people the two do go together. And when it does, maybe they might consider that, okay, well, the dominant is the head of household and they make all of the final authoritative decisions, so that should also happen in the bedroom. And that can create a sort of CNC, consensual non-consent dynamic, where the dominant head of household has full say over how and when sex happens. Of course, you know, if you like the 50s but you don't like CNC and you want to have sex in your kink, you don't have to do it this way. That is just another potential structure that some people feel goes along with the other ways that they have the 50s influence in their dynamic. And while there are many ways that having a 1950s roleplay influence can change the way you structure a relationship, I do want to move on to some rules. And the difference for me is that the structure is more of the backbone of the relationship, whereas the rules are about giving it its own unique flavor and texture. For example, perhaps having a rule that the submissive has to be wearing era-appropriate lingerie while in the dominant's presence, or have well-styled hair and makeup ready before the dominant returns home. This can be era particular, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be about just having that spirit of the time of always desiring to be presentable. The submissive may have to ask for an allowance to do era-appropriate maintenance, like getting their hair styled regularly or going for mani-pedis. This can also be part of keeping up that presentable appearance. The submissive may be expected to have a full hot meal ready for the dominant by the time they come home. And if the dominant is coming home late, then they would keep a plate of food warm for them in the oven until they return, keeping a full place set for them at the head of the table. For cooking for extra roleplay points, the submissive may not be allowed to use pre-prepared or shortcut foods, except when era appropriate, like Jell-O. The submissive may also help the dominant get ready for work in the morning, such as picking out a matching tie and shirt, making sure their shoes aren't scuffed, tying the tie on for them, or helping them shave. There may be a rule where the submissive is required to set aside a certain amount of time per week to train or learn a new era-appropriate skill. That could be basic homemaking, keeping a budget, home economics in general, learning how to hem pants, do basic repairs and other sorts of sewing projects, knitting, canning, making jams, homemade candles, anything like that. This could also include things like learning about manners or how to be a good host or mix cocktail drinks. This could be through in-person instruction, maybe taking local community college classes, or online or through reading books. But these suggestions are only just the start. If you want more ideas, you can look at fan fiction or erotica set during this time period. You can watch movies or TV shows from the 50s, and you can read books about manners, housekeeping, or how to be a good host. And do remember that the only limit is going to be your imagination and where you take inspiration from. It is okay to be a little anachronistic. If you want to do something that's not exactly what they would have done in the 50s, that is totally okay. It can be really fun to recreate everything as accurately as possible, but if a rule would really, really motivate you, even if it doesn't fit in the era, I think it is totally valid to want to include that. Now, one last piece of the dynamic puzzle that I want to discuss is discipline. Ah, yes. Everyone's favorite. One of the big draws that I have not yet mentioned is, of course, corporal punishment and discipline. The 50s were certainly an era where spanking your children or your spouse was a lot more acceptable and a lot more common. And while, of course, I would never endorse either of those things in a vanilla, non-negotiated relationship, I do think it is a fun idea to play around with in your own kinks. And of course, spanking is a really, really big part of that. Like, I think looking at the TV shows and the movies and the advertisements from that time period, spanking was everywhere. And like the movie McClintock, I think gave more people a spanking fetish than any other film ever produced. So if you like spanking as part of a discipline or as part of a fetish you have, the 50s may be a fun era to play around with. And if you want to know more about spanking, I would look at a book by Janet Hardy that is called Spanking for Lovers. It has the worst name, I think, but it is a really good and informative book. And I do think this offers a lot of really good ways to play around with the actual role play of this time period. If you have any sort of need for discipline in your relationship. Like, I don't know, maybe your submissive brings home the wrong brand of soup, or they overcook the chicken, or they forget to put your cigar out by the time you get home. Sounds like a good time for a good old-fashioned, over-the-knee discipline spanking. If you happen to have a brat, maybe you gave them a task of recreating an accurate 1950s dish, but you weren't specific enough. So what they made was a horrifying salad jello creation, including hot dogs and bananas. And that sounds like a good time for a little bit of a punishment spanking, because this can go either way. It can be a serious form of discipline for a DS relationship, or you can just do it for the sake of role play and having fun and having a unique approach to a punishment scene. And while we might think of spanking as only being with an open hand, there are other implements that you might want to use, like a hairbrush or a walking stick or belt, if you want to put a little bit of a spin on it. Now, outside of spanking, I really wasn't able to find a lot of examples of historical spouse discipline. I guess they just really loved spanking, so I'm gonna add some of my own ideas. If you are into financial domination, maybe it might make sense to lose privileges, such as losing an allowance for a week if there is a sufficient infraction, or not being allowed to get your nails done that week. If you're not into that, you can also do things like losing other privileges, like TV time, phone time, internet time. I have like a million videos on different discipline ideas, and with the right approach, I think many of those can be used in a 50s flavored dynamic. Of course, sometimes simple is best, and having a good old-fashioned 1950s "Dad, I'm disappointed in you" talk can work really, really well. Now, finally, I do want to discuss how you don't always have to go along those stereotypical gendered lines if you want to do 1950s roleplay or a 50s style dynamic. I know that I have talked a lot about husband and wife and dominant man and submissive woman, but it does not have to be that way. In my research, I was able to find many examples of same-sex couples that engage in this. I was able to find what is called reverse 1950s roleplay, where it is actually the woman that is the head of the household. And let's start there. So this can go like two main directions. The first one is like a full role swap, where the woman is the head of the household and they literally wear the pants. They're the ones that go to work, earn money, manage the expenses. They expect to have a hot meal when they get home. They are the ones that want to read a newspaper and drink whiskey and smoke a cigar. Typically, I think if you're doing it this way, it does seem to go more towards a male submissive, but of course any submissive of any gender can do this. But if you are a male submissive and this is the way things are played, it does tend to go more in a sissification, humiliation sort of direction, like taking on fully the housewife role of being the one to do the cooking, cleaning, running the errands, maybe cross-dressing, wearing a dress or accurate 50s clothing, stockings, undergarments at the same time. And I do want to bring up that I came up with a gender-neutral way to talk about being a housewife, and that is called being a house spouse. And anyone, please use that. I love this term. I guess hashtag house spouse. Oh, no, don't hashtag it. I don't want Twitter to know about this, but I do really enjoy that term if you want some gender neutral language at your disposal. Now, the approach that I do think is more common is having the woman technically be the head of the house, but sort of doing it from the bottom almost. And I say that, but not like in a topping from the bottom way, but in that the roles superficially appear to be the same on the outside as with the more traditional approach, but the intention and mindset is completely different. So it might still be that the man, now the lowercase man, is the one to work for the house and earn the money, but instead of it being a place of like being superior and being the head of the household, it's like you are working and earning money for the pleasure of your wife or the pleasure of your dominant partner. And on the other side of that, with the housewife or house spouse role, they might be the ones staying at home, but they are in control. They might even still do things like the housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and so on, but maybe it's more from a humiliation perspective. Maybe it's like, oh, you're such a helpless man. You have to have me stay at home wasting my time to pick up after you because you're too helpless to do it yourself. Like, everything totally depends on the mindset that you go into things with. So always remember that. Of course, it could also be where the submissive person that is going out and working is the one that earns the money but then comes home and is still the one to cook and clean. Or maybe there is a division of certain types of labor where, yes, maybe there is that humiliation part of some things, but maybe when they do stuff like open doors, take out the garbage, hold the umbrella for their partner over their head, that is all done from a perspective of service rather than, again, that authoritative, dominant, sort of patriarchal role. Or maybe it's the submissive partner that is responsible for both. Maybe they both work outside the home and relish the fact that their partner now taunts them with spending their hard-earned money on things like nails and purses and girls' nights out. And maybe when they get home, they also have to cook their own dinner and cook and clean while their partner just sits on the couch, watches TV, and has their feet up. But it doesn't even have to be that complicated. It can be as simple as following the model happy wife, happy life, or happy spouse, happy life, and simply doing whatever it is that is necessary to please them and make them happy, be it working hard at the office or doing the dishes and laundry when you come home. And I hope this goes to show that there are nearly infinite possibilities for how you choose to have this dynamic. It doesn't have to be just along strict gendered lines. You can make it whatever you want it to be. And that also includes mixing in whatever other existing power dynamics you might have. People seem to love putting CGL together with 1950s dynamics. Maybe that looks like being a 50s mother and son, or mother and daughter, or father and son, any combination you like. Of course, I also have to say for myself as a pet player, the era has a lot of TV shows about man and his best friend, the dog. So a little bit of Lassie roleplay, anyone? And on a very final note here, the last thing that I want to do is talk about how you can do this as a scene if you don't want it to be part of a larger dynamic. I think what this can kind of suffer from is the assumption that the only way you can do this role play is in a power exchange relationship. And that's a lot of commitment. That's a lot of time. Like, maybe you only want to do scenes, or you're only a bottom, but you still kind of like the role play aspect. Well, as it turns out, you can make just about any suggestion, rule, even parts of structure I mentioned into something that is only part of a scene and not part of some sort of larger negotiated power exchange. That could be something like the brat punishment I mentioned earlier, or maybe you have a service sub that really loves service, and so you tell them that you want an era-accurate 1950s dinner from an era cookbook, and you want them to wear a certain uniform while they do it, and maybe you have a cigar and whiskey after dinner is over. That doesn't have to be part of some sort of larger framework. It can totally be just for that scene and never ever again if you don't want it to. Sometimes even just wearing the fashion from that time period or doing a little bit of old-fashioned talk when you're in a scene can be enough to tell you if you like it or not, or if you want to do it as part of something larger in your relationship. But if you decide you only ever want it to be as a non-power exchange thing or only in individual scenes, that's also totally fine, and it's about what works for you and what you want out of your kink. So with that being said, I think that is everything that I have to talk about here today. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I really liked making it. It was a lot of fun to research, although sort of difficult in places to capture like the essence of the 50s. So I don't know what that means, but I did enjoy writing about it. I hope you all liked being able to watch this and you learned something. I would love to know what you all think down in the comment section. Is this something that you do? Are you interested in it? Do you have any experience with playing around in the role play of the 50s? Were there any key points of inspiration or ideas that I missed? Let me know down below, and I can't wait to see what you all have to say. If you enjoyed this, if you have not already, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to support what I do, please do check out my Patreon. A link to that will be down below. That is what makes this channel and videos like this possible. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.